You are wrong about this. I'm telling you the truth, Mayor Price. We've reviewed the documents, Clara. There's nothing to support this. I have witnesses. They saw everything. I saw that. I'll get it on the next round.
I've been writing facts. But I need to start seeing people. I have to do this.
We're with you.
Remember the plan.
By the time Ethan Walker reached the end of Briar Road, the porch light was already on, though his father had been dead for 3 days. It glowed weakly against the February dusk, a small yellow circle trembling over the cracked steps and the old white railing, as if the house had been waiting for him longer than any living person had. Ethan stopped his truck beside the mailbox and did not turn off the engine right away. The road behind him was empty. The town of Millbrook, Kentucky, had gone quiet in that way small towns do after supper, when diner lights soften, church bells stop, and every old house seems to remember more than it says. He had driven 4 hours from Columbus with a black suit folded across the passenger seat and an envelope from his father's lawyer lying beside it. Inside that envelope was a brass key tied with a faded blue thread. Nothing else had unsettled him as much. Not the phone call saying Samuel Walker had passed in his sleep. Not the short funeral notice printed in the Millbrook County Register. Not even the thought of standing in the same cemetery where his mother's name had never been carved into stone. It was the key that did it. Ethan had held it in his palm at a gas station outside Louisville and felt, for one strange second, like a boy again, barefoot on this same porch, listening to rain beat against the tin awning while his father stood in the doorway saying nothing. 25 years earlier, Ethan had walked away from this house with a duffel bag, $200, and a sentence he believed would protect him forever. "I will never come back here again." He had said it to his father's face. Samuel had not shouted after him. That had always been the part Ethan remembered most. His father had simply stood there in the kitchen light, one hand on the back of a chair, his expression closed, his silence heavier than any answer. Ethan had built a whole life around that silence. He became a carpenter. He learned how to frame walls, hang doors, restore floors, and measure twice before cutting once. He learned how to fix almost anything except the place inside him that still tightened whenever someone said the word home. Now the house sat at the end of Briar Road with peeling paint, sagging gutters, and the porch light burning as if Samuel had stepped out only minutes before. Ethan finally shut off the engine. The sudden quiet pressed against the windows. For a long time, he remained behind the wheel, his hand closed around the key. Across the yard, the old maple tree had lost one of its larger branches, and the swing beneath it hung crooked from a rusted chain. The front steps were darker than he remembered. The curtains in the living room were still the same dull green his mother had chosen when he was 7. He told himself he had come only because the lawyer said the estate papers required his signature. He told himself he would walk in, collect whatever needed collecting, sell the house, and leave before morning. But lies sound different when spoken in front of the place that raised them. Ethan opened the truck door. Cold air moved under his collar. Gravel shifted under his shoes as he crossed the yard, each step carrying him closer to a door he had imagined 1,000 times and avoided for half his life. At the bottom of the porch, he stopped again. The brass key felt warm now, though the night was turning sharp. He looked up at the porch light. Someone had changed the bulb recently. Someone had swept the steps. Someone had placed the key in an envelope and made sure it found him after Samuel was gone. Ethan's throat tightened, not with grief exactly, but with something older and less willing to be named. He reached for the railing, then pulled his hand back when his fingers touched a notch in the wood. He knew that mark. He had made it with a pocket knife the summer he turned 12, carving one crooked line for every inch he thought he had grown. Samuel had scolded him for damaging the rail, then measured him properly against the kitchen doorframe anyway. Ethan had forgotten that. Or maybe he had chosen not to remember. The porch boards creaked under his weight when he finally stepped up. At the door, the old brass key slid into the lock too easily, as if no time at all had passed. Before turning it, Ethan glanced once more at the yellow light above him and felt the strangest thought rise in him, quiet and unwelcome. Maybe the house had not been keeping him out all these years. Maybe it had been waiting for him to become old enough to come inside. He turned the key. The lock gave with a soft click. And somewhere deep in the house, something shifted, as if the past had heard him enter. Before Ethan could understand what the house wanted from him, he had to remember the night he first ran from it. Memory did not arrive all at once. It came in pieces, the way rain came through a bad roof, one quiet drop at a time until the whole room smelled of weather. He remembered being 18, tall enough to look his father in the eye, but still young enough to mistake silence for absence. He remembered the kitchen light buzzing over the table, the linoleum cold under his socks, and the sound of rain tapping against the window above the sink. His duffel bag had been on the floor beside him, half-packed, one sleeve hanging from the zipper like something trying to escape. Samuel Walker had stood near the stove in his work shirt, still wearing the sawdust of a long day on his cuffs. He was 46 then, though Ethan had thought of him as much older, because grief had a way of making adults look carved instead of living. On the table between them was the blue ceramic mug Margaret used to drink from before she left. Nobody drank from it anymore. Nobody moved it either. It sat there like a question both of them had agreed not to answer. Ethan had spent years waiting for his father to explain why his mother vanished from their mornings, why her sewing room stayed locked, why her name turned the house colder than winter. But Samuel always gave him the same tired answer. Some things are not for a boy to carry. That night, Ethan decided he was no longer a boy. He had been accepted into a carpentry program in Ohio, and he had saved enough money from odd jobs to buy a bus ticket. He told himself he was leaving for work, for freedom, for a life that did not smell like old coffee and things unsaid. But the truth was smaller and sharper. He wanted his father to stop him. He wanted Samuel to grab his coat, block the door, say his mother had loved him, say the house had not been one long punishment. Instead, Samuel looked at the duffel bag, then at his son, and said only, "If you have made up your mind, take the highway before the creek road floods." Ethan had never forgotten those words. He had carried them into cheap apartments, job sites, hospital waiting rooms, and every lonely Thanksgiving he pretended not to notice. For years, he had polished that sentence into proof. Proof that his father did not care. Proof that leaving had been the only way to survive. Proof that some men could build a house and still never make it feel like home. But memories, Ethan would later learn, are not always lies. Sometimes they are unfinished rooms. That night, after Samuel spoke, Ethan had said the thing he thought would wound his father enough to make him finally answer. "I will never come back here again." The words had filled the kitchen, hard and bright. Samuel did not raise his voice. He did not cross the room. His hand only closed around the back of the chair until his knuckles went pale, and his eyes moved once toward the locked sewing room at the end of the hall. Ethan had seen that glance, but he had not understood it. Not then. Not with rain in his ears and anger doing the work of courage. He lifted his bag, walked past his father, and opened the front door. Cold air rushed in. The porch light flickered above him. Behind him, Samuel said his name once. Ethan stopped, but did not turn around. If his father had said anything else, maybe the years would have bent differently. Maybe he would have stayed. Maybe he would have asked the question that had been waiting in the house since he was 7. But Samuel said nothing more. So Ethan stepped into the rain, crossed the porch, and walked toward the road with his duffel bag hitting his leg at every step. He did not see what happened after he reached the maple tree. He did not see Samuel come out onto the porch without a coat. He did not see his father take 3 steps into the rain, then stop as if an old promise had put a hand against his chest. Ethan only remembered the silence. He did not remember that the porch light stayed on until morning. 3 days before Ethan turned the brass key in the front door, he stood beneath a gray Kentucky sky and watched strangers lower their voices around his father's grave. The funeral had been small, but not empty, and that bothered him more than he expected. He had imagined Samuel Walker leaving the world the way he had seemed to live in it, alone, with only a pastor, a county clerk, and one son who had come because paper required what love had not. But by 10 in the morning, cars lined the gravel lane outside Millbrook Baptist Church. Men in work jackets stood with their hats in their hands. Women from the church carried foil-covered dishes into the fellowship hall. A retired mailman leaned on a cane near the back pew, staring at the floor as if he owed Samuel an apology nobody else knew about. Ethan sat in the front row with his hands folded, feeling like a visitor at the funeral of a man everyone else had known better than he had. The church smelled of old hymnals, floor polish, and coffee warming in the next room. Sunlight came weakly through the stained glass, touching the casket in narrow strips of blue and amber. Reverend Paul Harlan spoke softly about Samuel's patience, his craftsmanship, the porches he repaired without sending a bill, the widows whose gutters he cleaned before the first hard freeze, the teenagers he hired when nobody else trusted them to show up on time. Ethan listened with a still face. Each kind word felt like a door opening into a room he had never been allowed to enter. He wanted to reject it. He wanted to believe they were being polite because death makes even difficult men easier to praise. But grief has a strange honesty in small towns. People did not look dramatic. They looked burdened. They looked as if Samuel had carried something for them and never mentioned its weight. After the service, Ethan stood near the church steps while neighbors approached him one by one. They said things like, "Your father helped me fix my porch after the tornado warning," or "He drove my husband to Lexington for treatments when my car would not start," or "He asked about you more than he ever asked about himself." Ethan thanked them because that was what people did beside church doors, but every sentence unsettled him. He had spent 25 years believing his father's silence meant emptiness. Now Millbrook was handing him pieces of a man who had been quiet for reasons Ethan did not yet understand. Near the cemetery gate, Claire Donovan waited with a wooden box held against her coat. Ethan recognized her slowly, not because she had changed so much, but because memory had kept her 17. She still had careful eyes, the kind that noticed when a person was about to say they were fine and meant none of it. She did not hug him. She did not ask where he had been. She only said, "Your father left this at the library last fall. He said I should give it to you after the service, but only if you came." Ethan looked down at the box. It was small, handmade, sanded smooth, with a strip of blue thread tied around the latch. Something in his chest tightened. He asked what was inside, but Claire shook her head gently. "Samuel wanted you to open it at the house." Then she reached into her pocket and gave him a folded note. Its paper softened from being handled too many times. Ethan unfolded it beside the cemetery road. His father's handwriting was there, careful and square, the same hand that had once marked his height on the kitchen doorframe. The note said, "The blue key is not for the front door." Ethan read it twice. The wind moved through the bare trees. Behind him, people were still leaving flowers on Samuel's grave. For the first time that morning, Ethan stopped feeling like he had come to bury the past. He began to feel like the past had arranged to meet him there. When Ethan pushed the front door open, the house did not greet him with dust the way he expected. It smelled faintly of lemon oil, old wood, and the kind of coffee Samuel used to drink before daylight, strong enough to darken the whole kitchen. For a moment, Ethan stood in the entryway with one hand still on the knob, listening. The furnace clicked somewhere below the floor. A pipe settled in the wall. The clock in the kitchen ticked with a stubborn, ordinary patience, as if it had not spent 25 years measuring a son's absence. He stepped inside and closed the door behind him. The brass key remained in his palm, tied with that faded blue thread, and he did not put it in his pocket. He needed to feel its edges. He needed something small enough to hold while the house became too large around him. The living room was dim, lit only by the porch lights spilling through the front window and a narrow lamp near Samuel's chair. That chair still faced the television, though the screen was dark. Beside it sat a stack of newspapers folded with careful hands, each one marked with a thin pencil line beside the weather page. Ethan almost laughed at that, but the sound never made it out. His father had always checked the weather like it was a duty. Rain mattered to men who fixed roofs. Snow mattered to men who remembered roads washing out. On the mantel above the fireplace, there were no grand photographs, no framed awards, no evidence of a man trying to prove he had lived. There was only a small wooden cross, a jar of loose screws, and a picture of Ethan at 19 standing in front of a work truck in Ohio. Ethan moved closer. He did not remember sending that photograph. He remembered throwing it away after a foreman took it for the company newsletter. Somehow, Samuel had gotten a copy. Somehow, Samuel had placed it where he could see it every day. The discovery unsettled Ethan more than blame would have. Anger knew what to do with cruelty. It did not know what to do with quiet devotion. He walked into the kitchen next, and there the house tightened around him. The same round table sat beneath the window, its surface worn pale where elbows had rested for decades. 2 plates had been set out, one on each side, both clean, both empty. A blue ceramic mug sat near the stove. Margaret's mug. Ethan stopped so abruptly the floorboard complained under his shoe. He had not seen that mug since the night he left. He had imagined it broken, packed away, forgotten, anything but waiting in plain sight like a voice nobody had answered. On the refrigerator were grocery lists, a church calendar, and a faded magnet shaped like the state of Kentucky. Beneath it was a yellowed receipt from a hardware store in Columbus. Ethan touched it with 2 fingers. It listed lumber, hinges, wood glue, and a set of chisels. The date was 12 years old. He remembered that week. His tools had been stolen from a job site, and 3 days later an anonymous gift card had arrived in the mail with no return address. He had told himself it came from the Union Fund. Now the receipt trembled under his hand. He turned away before the feeling could take a name. At the end of the hall, the staircase rose into shadow. Halfway up, the wall still held the old family portraits, though most had faded at the edges. Ethan saw himself at 8, gap-toothed and sunburned, standing between Samuel and Margaret at a county fair. His mother's hand rested on his shoulder. Samuel's hand rested behind Ethan's back, not quite visible unless someone looked carefully. Ethan looked carefully now. Then he saw the door at the top of the stairs. Closed. Still painted white. Still marked near the handle where the wood had swollen in summer humidity. His mother's sewing room. The one room nobody entered after she left. Ethan climbed 3 steps, then stopped. The brass key pressed into his palm. The note from Samuel returned to him with quiet force. The blue key is not for the front door. Downstairs, the kitchen clock kept ticking. Outside, the porch light continued to burn. Ethan looked up at the locked room and understood, with a coldness that moved slowly through him, that his father had not brought him back merely to sign papers. Somewhere inside this house, Samuel Walker had left him a door that only the right kind of grief could open. By morning, Ethan had slept less than 2 hours, and even that had not felt like sleep so much as surrender. He woke in his old bedroom to gray light pressing through the blinds and the sound of a pickup passing slowly on Briar Road. For a moment, he did not know his age. The ceiling above him was still crossed by the same thin crack he used to trace with his eyes as a boy, pretending it was a river on a map leading somewhere far from Millbrook. The house was quiet beneath him, too quiet for a place that had once held his mother humming. Near the sewing machine, his father rinsing coffee grounds from the sink, and a younger version of himself moving through rooms with the careless noise of someone who believed home would always be there to resent. He dressed slowly, washed his face in the bathroom sink, and went downstairs with the brass key in his pocket. It felt heavier now. On the kitchen table, the wooden box from Claire sat unopened. Ethan had carried it in from the truck before dawn, then left it there as if distance could make it less personal. The blue thread around its latch matched the thread tied to the key, faded but deliberate. He made coffee because the house seemed to expect it. The first bitter smell rising from the pot was so familiar that he had to grip the counter for a second. That was where Claire found him an hour later, standing by the sink with a mug he had not tasted. She knocked once on the back door before opening it halfway, the way people did in Millbrook when they had known a family long enough to be careful, but not formal. She held a paper bag from Harper's Diner and wore a wool coat the color of wet stone. "I brought biscuits," she said. "People say casseroles are for grief, but I always thought grief needed breakfast first." Ethan looked at her, then at the bag, and almost smiled. "You still talk like a librarian who reads the last page before the first." Claire stepped inside and placed the bag on the table. "And you still answer kindness like it is a bill you did not agree to pay." The words were gentle, but they landed with the precision of someone who had known the boy before he learned to hide inside the man. Ethan looked away first. Claire did not push. She moved to the sink, rinsed a spoon, and glanced around the kitchen with an expression that was not pity. That mattered. Most people would have looked at the old cabinets, the worn floor, the 2 empty plates, and seen sadness. Claire looked as if she were entering a room that still deserved respect. After a while, she said, "Your father came to the library every Thursday." Ethan turned slightly. "For books?" "Sometimes. Mostly newspapers from Ohio. Columbus Dispatch, when we had it. Regional business. Pages. Weather reports. Anything that might mention road work, carpentry contracts, construction accidents." Ethan stared at her. The coffee had gone cold in his hand. Claire folded the top of the paper bag carefully. "He never said he was looking for you." He did not have to. Outside, a crow moved along the fence, black against the pale yard. Ethan thought of all the years he had believed his absence was complete, clean, final. He had imagined himself erased from this house, because erasure was easier to hate than longing. Claire reached into her coat pocket and took out a sealed cream-colored envelope. His name was written across the front in Samuel's square handwriting. "He left this with me too," she said. "But he gave instructions." Ethan did not take it yet. What instructions? Claire looked toward the hallway, then toward the stairs where the locked sewing room waited above them. "He said I should give it to you only after you spent one night in the house. He said anger could get you through the door, but it would not help you hear what was inside." Ethan felt the key press against his leg through the pocket lining. He wanted to be angry at the manipulation of it, at the planning, at the way his dead father still seemed to know how to make him stand still. But beneath the anger, something else had begun to move. Not forgiveness. Not yet. Something quieter. A crack in the old wall. He took the envelope from Claire and turned it over. On the back, Samuel had written 6 words. "Go to the workbench before upstairs." Ethan looked toward the narrow mudroom that led out to the shed behind the house, the place where Samuel had spent most of his evenings shaping wood, fixing chairs, and keeping his thoughts where no one could reach them. Claire saw the change in his face. "Do you want me to go?" she asked. Ethan shook his head, though he did not look at her. For the first time since he had come back to Millbrook, he did not want to be alone with what his father had left behind. The shed behind the house had always looked smaller from the kitchen window, but standing before it now, Ethan felt the old weight of it. The building leaned slightly toward the maple trees. Its red paint weathered into brown, its tin roof dulled by years of Kentucky rain. Samuel had built half the neighborhood from this little shed. He had repaired church pews here, mended kitchen chairs, carved porch rails, and kept his grief folded between wood shavings and coffee cans full of bent nails. Ethan stood at the door with Claire beside him, the envelope still unopened in his hand, and the brass key pressing a small circle into his palm. For a moment, he could almost hear the sound of his father sanding a board in long, patient strokes. Not hurried, never hurried. Samuel had believed would told a man what it needed if he stayed quiet long enough to listen. Ethan had once hated that about him. Now, the memory did not feel like hate. It felt like a language he had refused to learn. The shed door opened with a swollen groan. Cold air moved out, carrying the smell of cedar dust, machine oil, and winter. Sunlight entered through a high window and fell across the workbench in a pale rectangle. Everything was arranged with the same careful order Samuel had carried through life. Chisels lined by size. Clamps hung on the wall. A yellow tape measure lay straight beside a carpenter's square. Above the bench, a pencil mark on the wall read, "Fix what can still hold." Ethan stared at those words for a long time. Claire remained near the doorway, giving him the room without leaving him alone in it. On the workbench sat a metal drawer built into the underside, its small lock dark with age. Ethan knew it immediately. As a boy, he had tried to open it more than once, convinced his father kept money or secrets inside. Samuel had always said, "Some drawers are for later." Ethan took out the brass key with the faded blue thread and guided it into the lock. This time, the key resisted for only a second before turning. The drawer slid open with a whisper of dust. Inside was not money. Not the kind Ethan had imagined, anyway. There was a bus ticket from Millbrook to Columbus, dated the morning after Ethan left home. There was a photograph of Ethan at 19 beside a work truck, the same one from the mantle. There were newspaper clippings about construction projects in Ohio. Small notices with his name circled in pencil. Beneath them lay receipts from hardware stores, medical billing offices, and a vocational school Ethan had once attended after nearly dropping out because he could not afford the last payment. Each receipt had been folded and labeled in Samuel's square handwriting. Tools, tuition, clinic, winter coat. No explanation. No request to be thanked. Only proof. Ethan sat down slowly on the wooden stool beside the bench. The shed seemed to tilt around him. He remembered the stolen tools, the paid balance at the school, the envelope of cash that had arrived after he injured his wrist on a job and could not work for 3 weeks. He had called those things luck. He had called them timing. He had called them anything but his father. Claire stepped closer but did not speak. Ethan picked up the bus ticket last. Samuel had bought it at 6:12 in the morning, less than 8 hours after Ethan walked out. Not to stop him, not to drag him back, maybe only to know where the road had taken his son. Ethan closed his eyes. Anger did not leave him. It simply lost its certainty. Under the stack of papers was a small plastic case, the kind used for cassette tapes before the world learned to forget them. A strip of masking tape ran across the front. The handwriting was not Samuel's. It was softer, rounder, almost trembling. Margaret Walker. Do not play alone. Ethan opened his eyes and felt the shed grow very still. For 25 years, his mother had existed in his mind as a closed door, a missing voice, a chair nobody used. Now her name rested in his hand, light as plastic and heavy as a life he had never been told how to mourn. Claire looked at the tape, then at Ethan. He did not ask her to leave. He only held the cassette against his chest, and for the first time since coming home, he understood why Samuel had sent him to the workbench before the room upstairs. They found the cassette player in the hall closet, tucked behind a stack of old Christmas wreaths and a box of extension cords Samuel had wrapped with twist ties. It was silver, scratched at the corners, and heavier than Ethan expected, the kind of machine that belonged to a time when voices had to be carried carefully if anyone hoped to hear them again. Claire set it on the kitchen table, as if placing something fragile between them. Outside, late morning light moved across the yard, bright but cold, touching the bare branches of the maple tree and the roof of the shed where Samuel's secrets had waited in sawdust and silence. Ethan sat with the cassette in both hands. Margaret Walker. Do not play alone. He read the words again, though he already knew them by heart. His mother's handwriting pulled at a place in him that anger had never reached. It was not the handwriting of a woman abandoning a son. It was too careful for that, too full of effort. Claire plugged in the player near the counter and returned to her chair without speaking. She had a gift for silence, not the kind Samuel had used like a closed door, but the kind that made room for someone to breathe. Ethan placed the tape inside and pressed play. For a second, there was only static. Then came a small click, a rustle, and the faint sound of someone exhaling close to the microphone. Ethan's body went still before his mind understood why. The voice that followed was softer than memory, worn at the edges, but unmistakable. Ethan, sweetheart, if you are hearing this, it means your father kept his promise longer than I ever should have asked him to. The kitchen blurred around him. He did not move. He did not speak. Claire lowered her eyes to the table. Margaret's voice continued, uneven but clear enough to fill the room she had left behind. She told him she had been unwell in ways people in Millbrook did not know how to discuss back then. She said there were mornings when love was present, but strength was not. She said leaving had never meant he was unwanted. It meant she had reached a place where staying without help would have broken things she was trying to protect. She did not ask to be forgiven quickly. She did not make herself sound noble. She only spoke with the plain sorrow of someone telling the truth too late. You were 7 years old, she said. You liked pancakes with the edges almost burned. You hated green beans unless your father called them soldier beans. You used to fall asleep with one hand under your cheek and 1 foot outside the blanket. I remember, Ethan. I remember everything a mother should have stayed to see. Ethan pressed his fist lightly against his mouth. The smallest details hurt the most, not because they were dramatic, but because they proved she had carried him with her. A child could survive being left more easily if he believed he had been forgotten. Remembered absence was harder. The tape crackled, and Margaret paused long enough for the old machine to hum in the quiet. Then her voice returned, lower now. Your father wanted to tell you more. I stopped him. I was ashamed. I thought if you knew how weak I had become, you would spend your life wondering if sadness was waiting for you too. Samuel said secrets do not protect children forever. He was right, but I made him promise anyway. Ethan looked toward the hallway, toward the stairs, toward the closed white door at the top. For the first time, that room did not feel like an accusation. It felt like a place where someone had once tried to hold herself together and failed quietly. Margaret drew a shaky breath on the tape. If you hate him, let the hate rest on me too. He carried my silence because I asked him to. He let you believe he was hard because he thought keeping my last dignity might give you a better chance at your own life. He promised me he would let you hate him if it kept you alive. The words entered Ethan without force. That was what made them unbearable. No shouting, no grand confession, just a mother's voice crossing 25 years to rearrange everything he thought he knew. When the tape ended, the player clicked and spun into empty hiss. Nobody moved for a long while. Then Ethan reached out, stopped the machine, and placed his hand flat over the cassette as if he were covering a pulse. He wanted answers, but he no longer trusted the questions he had brought with him. Across the table, Claire looked toward the sealed envelope Samuel had left in her care. Ethan followed her gaze. The house was not finished speaking, and somewhere above them, behind the white door at the top of the stairs, the room his father had avoided was waiting with the rest of the truth. The afternoon carried a thin, washed-out light over Millbrook, the kind that made every storefront on Main Street look older than it had in the morning. Ethan rode in the passenger seat of Claire's small Subaru because he did not trust himself to drive through streets that kept offering him memories without permission. They passed Harper's Diner, where men in seed caps lifted their coffee cups and watched the car go by. They passed the hardware store where Samuel had once bought hinges, nails, and silence in equal measure. They passed the county library with its brick steps and American flag moving slowly in the cold wind. Ethan looked out the window and wondered how many times his father had walked those same sidewalks with his name held quietly behind his teeth. Claire did not fill the car with questions. That was one of the mercies she seemed to understand without being told. She only said, "Reverend Harlan is old now. He repeats himself sometimes. But when it comes to your parents, he remembers more than most people were allowed to know." Ethan kept the cassette case in his coat pocket, the plastic edge pressed against his ribs whenever the car turned. He had listened to his mother's voice only once, but it had already changed the shape of the day. Grief had not disappeared. Anger had not forgiven him for needing it so long. But something inside him had shifted from certainty to listening. That was a dangerous place for a man who had survived by deciding early and never looking back. Reverend Paul Harlan lived in a small parsonage behind Millbrook Baptist, in a white house with a ramp over the front steps and bird feeders hanging from the porch. He answered the door wearing a cardigan, slippers, and the patient expression of someone who had been expecting a difficult visit for years. "Ethan Walker," he said, and his voice trembled slightly around the name. "You have your father's hands." Ethan looked down before he could stop himself. His hands were rough, nicked at the knuckles, marked by work. Samuel's hands. The thought would have irritated him yesterday. Today it simply made him quiet. They sat in the parlor, where the walls were lined with photographs of baptisms, potluck dinners, church picnics, and children who had grown into adults without noticing the old man watching over them. Claire took the chair near the window. Ethan sat on the edge of the couch. Reverend Harlan poured tea no one asked for and took his time lowering himself into a recliner. "Your mother was not a cruel woman," he said finally. Ethan had expected the sentence, but not the tenderness in it. She was sick in a way folks did not speak kindly about back then. They had words, but not much understanding. Your father was afraid the town would turn her pain into gossip, and your mother was more afraid of that than she was of being alone. Ethan held the warm cup between both hands, though he had not tasted it. "So he let me blame him." Reverend Harlan nodded. He thought blame was something he could carry. He was already carrying everything else. The room went still except for the ticking of a brass clock on the mantel. Ethan looked toward a photograph on the wall, one of Samuel in a work shirt helping repair the church steps. His father looked younger there, but tired in the same way. "Why did nobody tell me?" Ethan asked. The question came out low, not angry enough to protect him. The old pastor folded his hands. "Because by the time you were old enough to ask, you had already learned how to hear every answer as another betrayal. And because Samuel believed one day you would come home ready for the truth to be more complicated than pain." Ethan swallowed once. Claire looked down at her hands. The sentence did not excuse the silence. Nothing could, but it gave the silence a shape, and shapes could be touched. Shapes could be understood. Reverend Harlan leaned forward slightly. "There is one room in that house your father never entered again either." Ethan lifted his eyes. "My mother's sewing room." The pastor nodded. After she left, Samuel stood outside that door many nights. "I saw him once when I came by after supper. He had the key in his hand, but he could not turn it. He said some rooms do not stay closed because they are empty. They stay closed because too much love failed inside them." Ethan felt the brass key in his other pocket, tied with blue thread, waiting like a small answer to a question he had not yet earned. Reverend Harlan reached into the drawer of the side table and removed a small envelope, yellowed at the corners. "Your father left this here years ago. He said I would know when to give it to you." Ethan took it carefully. On the front, Samuel had written only 3 words. "For upstairs now." Ethan did not open it right away. He already knew where the next door was. They drove back to Briar Road in the kind of silence that does not feel empty, only careful. The sun had lowered behind the ridge, leaving a pale strip of gold over the fields, and Ethan watched the familiar road bend toward the house, as if it had been waiting all afternoon to return him to the same question. Claire parked near the mailbox, but neither of them got out right away. The porch light was already burning again. Ethan had not turned it on before they left. He looked at it for a long moment, then at the envelope Reverend Harlan had given him, resting unopened on his knee. "For upstairs now." 3 words, and somehow they carried more weight than the whole funeral. He opened the envelope slowly. Inside was not a letter, only a small black and white photograph and a strip of paper in Samuel's handwriting. The photograph showed the upstairs hallway years earlier, before the walls had faded, before dust had settled along the baseboards, before one room became too painful to name. In the picture, Margaret stood beside a framed church picnic photograph hanging near the sewing room door. She was smiling, one hand resting lightly against the frame. Ethan turned the paper over. Behind the church picture, Samuel had written. Claire read the words beside him and said nothing. Inside the house, the hallway felt colder than the kitchen. Ethan climbed the stairs with the brass key in one hand, though he no longer knew whether it was tool, burden, or invitation. Claire followed a few steps behind. At the top, the white door waited in the same stillness it had kept for 25 years. Ethan reached for the framed church photograph on the wall, lifted it carefully from its nail, and found a small key taped to the back with yellowed masking tape. The key was not brass. It was thin, dull silver, and ordinary enough to break a man's heart. Samuel had known where it was. He had known all along. Ethan stood there with both keys in his palm, one tied with blue thread, one hidden behind a memory, and understood that his father had spent decades living beside a door he could open, but chose not to. Not because there was nothing inside, because there was too much. The silver key turned with a soft scrape. The door opened inward. No dramatic gust moved through the room. No ghostly answer rose to meet them. Only the quiet smell of fabric, cedar, and time. The sewing machine sat near the window beneath a cloth cover. Spools of thread lined a small shelf, colors faded but still arranged from light to dark. A chair stood beside the machine, angled toward the glass as if Margaret had once paused there to watch Ethan play in the yard. On the work table lay a child's jacket, unfinished, navy blue with one sleeve pinned but never sewn. Ethan walked toward it, as if approaching something living. He touched the fabric with 2 fingers. It was smaller than he expected. He had been 7 when she left, still young enough for a mother to measure his arms with string and tell him to stand still. Beside the jacket was a small notebook filled with measurements, grocery lists, and half-written lines that began like letters and ended in silence. "My sweet boy," one page said, then nothing more. Another read, "I hope you remember the pancakes." Ethan sat down in the chair by the window. The room did not accuse him. It did not absolve anyone either. It simply held what had remained when people ran out of strength to speak. Claire stayed near the doorway, her hands folded, letting him enter the memory alone. On the far side of the table, beneath a square of muslin, Ethan noticed a sealed envelope. His name was on the front. For one fragile second, he thought it was Margaret's. Then he saw the handwriting, careful and square, and the room seemed to lean closer. It was Samuel's. Ethan held the envelope for a long time before opening it, not because paper could hurt him, but because he finally understood that truth did not always arrive like a door swinging wide. Sometimes it waited in a sealed corner of a room no one had entered for decades, patient enough to become heavier than furniture. The sewing room had grown dim around him. Evenings settled against the window, turning the yard below into soft gray shapes, and the porch light cast a thin gold reflection across the glass. Claire remained near the doorway, still as a witness, not stepping closer, not turning away. Ethan slipped one finger beneath the flap and opened the envelope carefully, as if Samuel might somehow feel the roughness of his hands. Inside were 4 pages folded twice. His father's handwriting covered them in even, deliberate lines, the kind made by a man who had measured boards his whole life and still feared cutting the wrong place. Ethan began to read. Samuel did not begin with an apology. That surprised him. He began with the truth of the room. He wrote that Margaret had loved this space because she could make broken cloth useful again, because fabric never asked why it had torn, because a stitch was one small way to believe repair was possible. He wrote that after she left, he stood outside the door every Thursday night for almost a year with the silver key in his hand, and every time, he failed to enter. Not because he blamed her, not because he blamed Ethan, because the unfinished jacket on the table was the last thing she had touched for their son, and Samuel had not known how to face the tenderness of it. Ethan looked at the navy blue sleeve, still pinned after 25 years, and felt something in him go quiet. He read on. Samuel wrote about the night Ethan left. He wrote that he had wanted to stop him so badly his chest hurt. He had wanted to say, "Your mother did not leave because of you." He had wanted to say, "I am not cold, son, I am afraid." He had wanted to say many things, but promises have a way of becoming walls when people mistake silence for loyalty. Margaret had asked him to protect Ethan from the weight of her illness, from the town's judgment, from the fear that sadness could pass down like an heirloom. Samuel had agreed because he loved her, and because he loved his son, and because sometimes love makes foolish bargains with pain. Ethan lowered the letter for a moment. He did not cry loudly. He simply sat with one hand over his mouth and breathed as if the room had less air than before. Claire looked down at the floor. Samuel's letter waited in his lap. When Ethan continued, his father's words grew plainer. "I know you may still hate me when you read this. I will not argue with that. A father should not ask his child to understand what he could not explain. But I need you to know I watched for you in every way I was allowed. I knew when you made foreman. I knew when your wrist was hurt. I knew when you bought your first truck. I knew when you stopped using the last name Walker on job applications for a while. I knew you were alive, and some days that had to be enough." Ethan closed his eyes. He remembered all the years he thought being unwatched meant being free. He had not known it also meant someone loved him from too far away to be forgiven. The final paragraph was shorter. "If you still need someone to blame, blame me. I can carry it a little longer, even from where I am. But before you sell this house, open the wall behind the pantry. I left you what I did not know how to send. After that, do with the house what gives your heart the most peace." Ethan read the last line twice. The wall behind the pantry. Downstairs, the old kitchen clock began to chime 6, each sound moving through the house like a footstep. Ethan folded the letter along its original creases and held it against his chest. For the first time in 25 years, his father's silence did not feel empty. It felt crowded with everything he had never been taught to say. Then Ethan stood, turned toward the doorway, and looked past Claire toward the stairs. The house had given him his mother's voice and his father's confession. But behind the pantry wall, something older than apology was still waiting to be found. Ethan and Claire came down the stairs without speaking, carrying with them the quiet of the sewing room, the cassette, the letter, and the strange ache of learning that the people who heard him had also loved him in ways too tangled to name cleanly. The kitchen looked different now, though nothing in it had moved. The blue mug near the stove, the 2 empty plates on the table, the refrigerator humming under the church calendar. Even the old floorboards beneath his shoes seemed less like evidence and more like witnesses. Ethan stood before the pantry door and looked at the narrow wall beside it, a strip of painted wood no wider than his shoulders. He had walked past that wall 1,000 times as a child. He had leaned against it while waiting for toast. He had pressed his ear to it during thunderstorms, pretending he could hear the house breathing. He had never imagined it was holding anything back. Claire opened the drawer near the sink and found a flashlight. Ethan went out to his truck and returned with a small canvas tool bag, the same one he carried to every job site. For a moment, the sight of his tools on Samuel's kitchen floor made the years fold strangely. Father and son, both carpenters, both better with wood than words, both standing in the same house at different times trying to open what silence had built. Ethan ran his palm along the pantry wall until he found it, a seam so fine only a man who had spent his life studying boards would notice. Samuel had made the false panel well. Of course he had. Ethan almost smiled, and the almost smile hurt. He used to pry bar gently, not wanting to damage more than he had to. The panel resisted, then loosened with a soft wooden sigh. Behind it was a shallow space between studs, and inside that space sat a rectangular tin box, painted dark green, wrapped once with the same faded blue thread tied around the brass key. Ethan set the pry bar down. The thread stopped him more than the box did. It was the trail Samuel had left him, one blue line through the house, from the envelope to the workbench, from the workbench to the room upstairs, from the room upstairs to this hidden place behind the pantry. Ethan lifted the tin box out with both hands. It was not heavy, but he held it as if weight could not be measured in pounds. On the lid, Samuel had taped a note. For the birthdays I missed beside you. Ethan sat at the kitchen table before opening it. Claire remained standing near the counter, her eyes lowered in respect. Inside were envelopes, dozens of them, each one marked with a date in Samuel's careful handwriting. Ethan's 19th birthday, his 20th, his 21st. Every year after he left. Some envelopes were thick, some thin. Some had small photographs tucked inside. Some held newspaper clippings. Some held nothing but a single page written in the plain voice of a man who had learned too late that love kept unwritten can become another kind of absence. Ethan opened the first one. Son, today you are 19. I do not know if you ate cake. I hope somebody remembered. If nobody did, I am remembering here. He opened another. Son, I saw a notice about your apprenticeship. You always had good hands. You used to take apart the toaster just to understand why bread came back warm. Then another. Son, I heard about your wrist. I sent what I could through a man who would not say my name. You may be angry if you ever learn it was me. Be angry after you heal. One envelope had a photograph of Ethan standing beside a half-built porch in Ohio, taken from far away, probably clipped from a local construction article. On the back, Samuel had written, "He stands like his mother when he is thinking." Ethan pressed the photograph to the table and looked away. The room went soft around the edges. He did not break apart. He simply bent forward, elbows on his knees, and let the truth settle without defending himself against it. He had not been unloved. He had been loved from a distance shaped by fear, pride, promises, and the kind of regret that learns to write letters it never sends. At the bottom of the box was one final envelope without a birthday date. The paper was newer than the rest. On the front, Samuel had written, "For the day you come home." Ethan held it, but did not open it yet. Outside, the porch light glowed against the kitchen window, steady and patient. For the first time, Ethan understood that his father had not hidden these letters to control him. He had hidden them because he was still hoping his son would one day enter the house slowly enough to hear them. Ethan did not open the final envelope that night. He carried it upstairs and placed it on the small desk in his old bedroom, where the wood was still scarred by pencil marks, pocket knife scratches, and one round stain from a glass of sweet tea he had knocked over the summer before everything changed. Some truths were not meant to be consumed quickly. Some had to sit in the room with a person until the heart stopped bracing for impact. He slept there for the first time in 25 years, under a quilt that smelled faintly of cedar, with the porch light drawing a thin golden line across the ceiling. Before dawn, he woke to the sound of rain tapping the window. Not hard rain, just enough to make the roof speak. For a moment, he lay still and listened to the house the way Samuel might have listened to wood. The walls creaked. The pipes shifted. Somewhere downstairs, the refrigerator hummed. The house was old, wounded in small places, but it was not finished. By 9 in the morning, a white sedan pulled into the driveway behind Ethan's truck. The real estate agent, a woman named Marlene Price, stepped out wearing a navy coat and practical shoes, carrying a folder thick with forms. She had handled half the estate sales in Millbrook and spoke with the brisk kindness of someone who had learned not to linger too long in other people's grief. Ethan met her on the porch with the brass key in his hand. The faded blue thread moved slightly in the wet wind. Marlene looked at the sagging gutter, the old siding, the porch rail that needed sanding, and the maple tree leaning over the yard. "It has good bones," she said, which was what people said about houses when they were trying not to mention how much work waited inside. Ethan nodded. He had planned for this. Sign the listing agreement. Empty the rooms. Let a family from Louisville or Lexington buy the place as a weekend restoration project. Let strangers paint the walls, replace the floorboards, take down the old photographs, and make the house innocent by making it unfamiliar. He walked Marlene through each room, while Claire waited quietly at the kitchen table, sorting Samuel's letters back into the tin box. The living room, the hallway, the kitchen, the pantry wall, now repaired lightly but not hidden from Ethan's eyes. Upstairs, Marlene admired the space, measured windows, mentioned natural light, and paused outside the sewing room without entering until Ethan opened the door himself. The unfinished jacket still lay on the table. Margaret's thread still waited on the shelf. Samuel's letter was folded beside the machine. Marlene lowered her voice. "We can include some items in the estate sale, or clear everything before showing." Ethan looked at the jacket. Clear everything. The phrase moved through him like cold water. For years, he had wanted nothing from this house. No furniture, no dishes, no photographs, no proof that his pain had an address. But now every object seemed to be holding a sentence somebody had been too afraid to speak. Downstairs, Marlene set the papers on the kitchen table and explained the process. Ethan listened. He really did. He understood market value, inspection issues, closing timelines, repair credits. He had built enough houses for other people to know that a home could become numbers if a person stood far enough away from it. She slid a pen toward him. Claire looked down, giving him privacy. Ethan picked up the pen. Outside, rain gathered at the edge of the porch roof and fell in steady drops. The porch light was still on, unnecessary in the morning, glowing softly against the gray. Its reflection caught the brass key lying beside the papers, turning the blue thread almost silver. Ethan stared at it. He thought of Samuel buying a bus ticket and never using it. Margaret recording her voice because staying had become impossible, but forgetting her son had not. 25 birthday letters behind a pantry wall. A father standing outside a sewing room every Thursday night with a key he could not turn. Ethan set the pen down. The room did not change, but something inside him did. "I am not ready to sell," he said. Marlene nodded with the quiet grace of a woman who had heard many versions of that sentence. After she left, Ethan remained at the table until the rain slowed. Then he opened the final envelope. Samuel's last letter was only one page. "Son, if you are reading this in the house, then you have already done the hardest thing. You came back. Do not keep it because of me. Do not sell it because of anger. Let the house become whatever helps you stop standing outside your own life." Ethan folded the letter and walked to the front door. He turned off the porch light for the first time since arriving, then turned it back on again, not because the house needed it, but because someone else might one day. By spring, the house at the end of Briar Road no longer looked abandoned to people passing slowly in pickup trucks on their way into town. The gutters had been repaired, the porch rail sanded smooth, and the cracked steps rebuilt with boards. Ethan cut himself in the shed where Samuel had once hidden more love than any drawer should have been asked to hold. He did not restore the house quickly. He refused to make it look untouched by time. Some scars in would deserve to remain visible, not because damage was beautiful, but because repair meant more when the break could still be remembered. Claire came on Thursdays after the library closed, bringing coffee from Harper's Diner and boxes of donated books for the front room. Reverend Harlan sent over folding chairs from the church basement. The retired mailman brought a porch swing chain he had kept in his garage for no reason he could explain. In small towns, healing sometimes arrived the way gossip did, person by person, quietly carrying more than it said. By May, the sign near the road was finished. Ethan carved the letters himself, then stood back while Claire held it level against the post. "Walker House. Open Thursdays." She looked at him when she read the words, but did not ask if he was sure. She had learned that some decisions were too tender to interrupt. The first evening, only 3 people came. A widower who wanted to fix an old rocking chair because his wife had loved it. A high school senior who said he needed help building a bookshelf for his mother. A woman from the church who brought a box of fabric and asked if anyone knew how to sew a torn sleeve. Ethan showed the boy how to measure twice before cutting. He helped the widower sand the worn arms of the rocking chair. Then, when the woman placed the torn sleeve on the kitchen table, Ethan went upstairs and brought down Margaret's thread box. He did not know everything about sewing, but he knew where his mother had kept the blue thread. That was enough to begin. The sewing room did not remain locked. Ethan cleaned it, opened the curtains, and left the unfinished jacket on the table beneath a glass cover, not as a shrine, but as a reminder that love can stop mid-stitch and still be real. Samuel's letters stayed in the green tin box on a shelf in the kitchen, close enough to reach, but no longer hidden inside a wall. Ethan read one each month, slowly, allowing his father to become human at a pace his heart could survive. He did not forgive all at once. Forgiveness, he learned, was not a door thrown open. It was a house being aired room by room. One Thursday evening, after the last chair was folded and the last truck pulled away, Ethan stood alone on the porch with the brass key in his hand. The faded blue thread had grown thin from being carried, touched, remembered. For years, that key had felt like a demand. Then it had become a question. Now, as fireflies lifted from the grass and the Kentucky dusk settled soft over Briar Road, it felt like an answer. He walked inside, hammered a small hook beside the front door, and hung the key there where anyone entering could see it. Beneath it, Claire had placed a narrow strip of wood with words Ethan had carved from Samuel's last letter. "Stop standing outside your own life." Ethan touched the key once, then turned toward the porch. The light above the steps was glowing, the same yellow light that had pulled him back on the night he thought the house was only a grave for old pain. Now it shone over fresh boards, open windows, and voices that would return the next Thursday and the Thursday after that. He understood then that coming home had not changed what happened. His mother still left. His father still stayed silent too long. A son still spent 25 years mistaking distance for proof that he had not been loved. But the house had kept the fuller story until he was ready to hear it. Ethan stood in the doorway until the sky darkened, neither inside nor outside, but no longer trapped between the two. And for the first time in his life, the porch light did not feel like someone waiting for him to come back. It felt like someone trusting him to leave the door open.